From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Let's be in no doubt. Our world is more dangerous and contested now than it has been for decades.
That was the clear warning from the new head of MI6, Blaise Metrawelli, on Monday. It was echoed by a similar assessment from the new head of the Armed Forces, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton.
We have to prepare to protect ourselves from an array of real physical threats of growing sophistication.
And who's behind those threats? All fingers were pointed in one direction.
I'm going to break with tradition, and I won't give you a global threat tour, but I will focus here on Putin's Russia.
The Russian leadership has made clear that it wishes to challenge, limit, divide, and ultimately destroy NATO.
And as Russia's methods become more sophisticated and aggressive, the UK has to be prepared to meet the threat. Because as General Sir Richard Barrons tells us, it's us, the British public, who are in the crosshairs.
I would guess most people listening to this isn't part of how they think about their lives. And why should they worry? Well, they should worry because they are actually the target.
The story today: is Britain prepared for a conflict with Russia? Richard, would you mind just starting by introducing yourself to our listeners?
So my name is formally General Sir Richard Barrons. I was a commander of Joint Forces Command and therefore one of the UK Chiefs of Staff until 2016, and for the last 10 years I've been in this curious afterlife of military service, and I run Universal Defence and Security Solutions, which is the biggest collection of former Army, Navy and Air Force people.
Richard, earlier this week we had some very serious warnings from the new head of MI6, Blaise Metrawelli, and Sir Richard Knighton, the new Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of the Armed Forces. What did you make of their speeches?
So the first thing is, it's annoying to me anyway if people were surprised by the sorts of things that these two very senior officials said, because they're merely the latest in quite a long line of ministers in some cases, and certainly officials and military people explaining that we do live in this very much more difficult and uncertain world of state-level confrontation. The point that I think particularly the Chief of the Defence Staff was making, it's not something that you can outsource to the armed forces any longer. This is something that now affects the whole of society, and it needs a whole of society response.
He also said that the situation was the most dangerous he'd ever known it.
I will argue that the situation is more dangerous than I have known during my career, and the price of peace is rising.
Do you think that's right? Is the threat the highest you've known it in your time in the armed forces?
I absolutely agree. From 1989, and I would say to 2014, marked by the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine then and Crimea, for that 30-odd years, we lived in an era where we couldn't point to a state-level threat to Europe and not the UK. No one wanted to talk about the risks of invasion or civil war. No one felt that there was an existential threat to how we live and our defence and security. We've had state confrontation before. But what is unique is that this is playing out in what feels like a much more zero-sum world, where the combination of the global population touching 8 billion, the known predicted effects of climate change, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and then all the massive changes that come with the digital age in the way it affects how we live, work and play, and obviously, therefore, how we fight. That canvas of risk and uncertainty underpins this state confrontation. And so the risks are really high of states falling out and fighting, not perhaps because they originally wanted to, but because they genuinely feel they have no alternative in their own preservation.
And Richard, you said earlier that you didn't think people should be surprised by these warnings. They should be alert to the fact that this is already happening. And I suppose people in defence and intelligence very much are. If you were trying to explain to ordinary people at home why this should be alarming to them, I mean, how seriously should they be taking it?
I would guess most people listening to this isn't part of how they think about their lives. They worry about many other things, welfare and the NHS and education and potholes. And they don't yet see the case that they should be worried by the sorts of things, people like me, but specifically this week, that the head of the Secret Intelligence Service and the Armed Forces are saying. And why should they worry? Well, they should worry because they are actually the target. They are the focus if we end up having a battle of wills between, say, Russia and the West, because war always has been a battle of will, and it's the will of civil society that's decisive, not the will of the armed forces. The armed forces' job is to fight even when it's hard. And so in the world we live now, where we rely, for example, on the digital architecture that sustains how we get our energy, our food, our communications, our transport, and our medicine, and all of those things. The fact is, if you want to bring the UK down, people just like me will target daily life first, as well as potentially the armed forces. So from my perspective, every UK citizen should know how dependent they are on the things that sustain their daily life, and that there are people in our world today who know how to make them stop and have the tools to do that. And that's before you have a conversation about, well, what if the sorts of things you saw happening to Kyiv, missiles and drones, were applied to the UK, because it would feel just the same and be just as damaging and profoundly horrible.
Well, so talk us through that. I think people still struggle to think of what a war with Russia would actually look like. As you say, there are so many different facets of attack that are already occurring. Talk us through that. What are we already seeing?
So the bits we're already seeing every day are the intrusions and attacks on our digital infrastructure. Russia is clear how, in theory, using cyber, it could diminish, potentially destroy aspects of those things that we rely on for our everyday lives. And a military extension of that is the way Russia understands, as well as we do, that those cables that bring us the internet and keep the City of London running, that run under the sea, are large and vulnerable and very hard to protect. And similarly, the things like the gas pipeline that brings a lot of our energy from Norway to the UK. And so the fact that you see Russian ships exploring where those cables and pipelines are is not out of curiosity. It's so that there is a provision, if they felt they needed to cut them off. And that would have profound consequences.
The British government says a Russian spy ship sailing on the edge of UK waters has pointed lasers at the pilots of an RAF reconnaissance aircraft that was monitoring its activities. It is the second time the Russian ship, the Yantar, has made an incursion this year.
So the first part of thinking about a war with Russia is that those things that daily life will depend on are the first targets. And then there would be some other things that would add to that. And I think, given that most adults these days carry a mobile phone, and those mobile phones rely on access to space for the GPS, cutting off the access to space-based assets would also be part of this confrontation below the threshold of military conflict. All of that would be in jeopardy. If we then step up above the threshold of into military conflict, if Russia decided to make war on the UK, the thing we're not really talking about is the Russian army trying to invade the UK. It's obviously a long way away, and it would have to get across quite a lot of the rest of Europe to get here. So we're talking about how Russia could harm the UK using other military means. And those other military means are essentially missiles, so ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and air-delivered bombs. And they could be targeted on things like our own power infrastructure. They would be targeted, I think, on our principal military and governmental institutions. And when we think about that, we should recognize that the missiles that would target the UK might make their way across Europe from Russia, but they are as likely to come from ships and submarines in the Atlantic. And so we have a 360-degree problem.
In terms of the prospects of a direct attack, as you described, with missiles and drones, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton sort of said that the likelihood of that was small, but not insignificant.
Right now, the chances of Russia attacking the UK is considered by our analysts to be remote. That means less than 5%. But that is the same chance of Liverpool winning the Premier League, according to the bookies over the weekend. So it's not zero.
For you, I mean, what are the odds of that happening? But also, is there a timeline? Are there moments over the next decade when we are more vulnerable?
In terms of military capability, does Russia have the means to do this to the UK if it chose to? And the answer to that is yes, now, today. But it doesn't have the intent to do that. There's no rational case for thinking that President Putin would think this is a good idea. And so rationally, the percentage chance of this occurring is very small. I would say no more than 5%. But that's really not the vital question, because if you look over history at how most wars start, they start because there's an issue, there's difficult relationships, there's a head of steam, but then quite often something happens and it acts like a valve and it's irrational, but the red mist descends, and then things happen as a result of misunderstanding or miscalculation or a rush of blood to the head. That it seems to me the chances of Russia firing missiles at the UK is more likely to be the result of a decision taken in President Putin's mind because of something that's happened, which in his eyes merits this kind of response. And right now, we need to be clear, the most likely reason to get to that sort of place, unlikely though it remains, is going to be over whatever happens next in Ukraine as it approaches some sort of ceasefire, which the UK, rightly in my view, and other nations have already committed to underpin with their own military forces in and around Ukraine. So that's a very uncomfortable thought for President Putin. It's the right thing to do, but it is going to take us closer to falling out.
We will talk about how prepared we are for a potential war. But how prepared is Russia? A lot of people here will have seen news reports of how they've struggled at times with Ukraine. They've had to conscript prisoners and criminals. How prepared would they be? What is their situation like in terms of manpower and equipment? Would they be ready for a war with the West?
So in my view, we should be quite clear that Russia is ready for war because it believes it's at war, and it believes that the NATO is an aggressive institution that wants to take advantage of Russia. So it has a number of advantages. The first is it's got a mobilized economy. It's become a very militarized society, and a lot of its industry has shifted to making equipment and weapons and ammunition for the war in Ukraine. Secondly, Russia has learned an awful lot from its disastrous failings in the early years of the war in Ukraine in particular. It has mobilized a lot of people, and the bit that I think that's often overlooked is the Russian army that's facing off, for example, against the Baltic states has been restored. It now has a lot of people and a lot of equipment. So it is at a much higher state of readiness than frankly, much of NATO. And because Russia thinks it's at war with us and is at war in Ukraine, it is mentally ready for all the hardships and the mobilization imperatives that come with going to war in a way that the West is not.
Richard, given the warnings that we've had coming out of both MI6 and the armed forces this week, a lot of people will be wondering just how prepared we are for a potential war with Russia. Give us a sense of how ready we are. If it was a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are we for a big war?
So I'm asked that question a lot, and it's a very complicated question to answer because it's not just about the armed forces, it's about how ready is civil society and government and industry. But if I'm asked to put a very crude metric against it, I would say on a scale of 10, we're at about 2.5, possibly trending 3. And we should recognize that we're in that state because we're now in a different world, this era of state confrontation with a much higher bar for resilience and deterrence. So the gap between where the world means we need to be now and where we actually are is bigger. And it's been made bigger by a couple of important things. The first is the US taxpayer is not going to subsidize our way out of this any longer. And secondly, we are talking about the 21st century. And so closing the gap from where we are to where we need to be is about digital age transformation. It's not about recreating Cold War armed forces. So that it's a bigger and more complex journey. So we have a map for this, but given our current fiscal and economic circumstances, we have as a society consciously chosen to get to where we need to be in about 10 years. Now, things get better in part before then, but we don't cover all the bases until, frankly, beyond 2035. And as a society, we have just chosen, and we just chose again in the most recent budget, to spend the money that we have in government on other things that we rightly, but arguably, want more. So health and welfare and education and potholes. And in the gap, we can't rely on the US because they don't want to do this anymore, and we should respect that. But we're now trying to rely on our allies who are spending more money, like Germany and Poland. But above all, bizarrely, we're also relying on our opponents to leave us alone until we've chosen to afford to get to a better place. And for me, that's the dilemma.
Well, I mean, do you think that's a sensible bet? Do you think we've got 10 years before we really have to worry about this?
So personally, I am absolutely convinced we don't have 10 years. We know the problem with Russia is likely to get more difficult around some sort of settlement or ceasefire in Ukraine. So I subscribe to we need to be in a much better place as part of NATO in 3 to 5 years. And it's not a question of affordability. It's a question of choice, because we as a society, and I do mean as a society because the government reads the polls and asks its voters what it wants. We as a society have so far chosen not to make the hard choices. It makes me and people like me very anxious, but we also recognize that until civil society perceives the risks, at least to some degree in the way that people like me do, nothing is going to change. And therefore, we're probably not in a place where a government is going to choose to spend more money on defence now because its voters aren't encouraging it to do that. They'll spend more money in defence on the back of a catastrophe we should have avoided. That, for me, is the dilemma of our time.
And for you, I mean, how much more would it take? Is there a figure and a date that it would need to be delivered by that would make us feel more secure?
So that sounds a very straightforward question, but it's very hard to answer because part of the answer is about the capacity of the armed forces to absorb more money quickly. But essentially, defence needs of the order of an additional, I would say, and I'm an outsider here, £15 billion a year from now onwards in order to accelerate the transformation that the Defence Review has prescribed at the speed the risks suggest that we should go at. But that's only part of the problem, because if resilience is a whole of society endeavour. It's just as important as a conversation across civil society about the expectations on every citizen and on businesses and on government at all levels and on institutions to play their part in resilience, because everybody is on the pitch. And actually the primary target in war in the 21st century is civil society, not so much the military. So we have to fix the whole thing. And therefore, some of this is about money and some of it is about culture and education and training and planning and resources.
Well, talk to us about that, because, you mentioned earlier that we're having to rely much more on our allies. The different countries within NATO seem to have a very different attitude to how serious the threat is, and we seem to be on the laxer side. What would it take to improve our readiness? What's missing?
So the first thing that would need to happen is there would need to be a debate, a discussion at all levels of society about what resilience really means and what part they need to play in it. So, for example, at the level of a citizen, at a time when you have to conceive of a successful cyber attack, turning the electricity and the water off, it's not going to be enough for that citizen just to complain volubly with their remaining battery on their mobile phone that somebody else should do something about this. It's part of their role as a citizen to display some resilience to that. And yes, people will try and fix it, but they need to recognize they have a part to play. Same for air and missile attack. Again, citizens should know that this actually can happen and have some sense of what to do when it does happen in support of the emergency services. So Sweden has a concept of total defence. For most Swedish citizens, it's bizarre that the UK hasn't got a big and healthy reserve for the armed forces, or that citizens don't know the part that they need to play, because for historical and cultural reasons, they have got this. Obviously, their geography and their history is different, but they're there. For Germany, an astonishing change just in the last 3 years in the way that they think about the problem of Russia. They're going to spend an enormous sum of money. Their defence budget will be 152 billion euros by about 2030. They're spending so much money that they will restore their military deterrence to the extent that 5 years from now, we should expect Germany to be the preeminent land power in Europe again.
Wow.
And that's not been the case for a long time.
So completely overtaking us.
Overtaking the UK and France, because for decades the UK and France have been the European military leaders, and German spending will now eclipse that, certainly on the land, in the army, less certainly in the air, and definitely not in the maritime environment, where the UK will, I think, retain an edge, but a very small edge.
Before the last election, there was some talk here about the idea of reintroducing national service. Do you think it's time to reopen that debate again?
So I would define national service differently. In fact, I would define it in the way we've talked about, that you have individuals and families and businesses and institutions that know what to do on a very, very dark day. So that's, for me, where national service starts. And then we should recognise that if the UK were to go to war, part of NATO more likely, that war is unlikely to be an event, a couple of weeks here or there. It's much more likely, as you see in Ukraine, to be an enduring confrontation. And in that setting, you would need all the armed forces that we have. And we have very intelligent armed forces, but very small, and right now under-equipped and under-trained, in my view. But you would need the armed forces, and we would then have to make them bigger using the reserves we have. That's where you go first. Then the volunteer reserve, which in the past has been called the territorial army. So those people who volunteer for essentially part-time employment in the armed forces. And then that's unlikely to be enough if you're in a war that goes over months and into years. So the next thing you would do is call for volunteers. Once you've exhausted that pool of volunteers, you're going to have to compulsorily draw people into the armed forces. That's called conscription. the UK might consider doing that. But what no one is arguing for is to go to conscription now, because we can't point to the imperative, nor could the armed forces absorb it. And we're not arguing that conscription is the first thing you do. But it is a measure in these difficult times for our world that we do have to know how we would apply if we needed to. And at least let's have that conversation.
Richard, a lot of the things that you've talked about rely on having a bigger, broader discussion within society about the risks that we now face. That conversation hasn't happened. Is there a danger that it's not only society that isn't taking the risk seriously enough? Is the government?
So I can't speak for the government, but I talked to lots of ministers and officials, and they absolutely do understand this. But they're going to keep coming back around to their problem, which is civil society isn't with them. So we are in a bit of a chicken and egg situation. The only way I think this changes beyond an event, and I, having done this for some time, absolutely clear, nothing that people like me says will touch the needle in civil society. The people who want to listen to people like me will listen, and everybody else will just go about their day. But the thing that might move it is really in entertainment. So recently there's been The House of Dynamite on Netflix.
I always thought just being ready is the point. It keeps the villain in check. Keeps the world straight. They see how prepared we are. No one starts a nuclear war.
The Sky News did a podcast called War Game, which I was part of, which is trying to bring to life this world that you and I have been talking about. And for me, the most recent example was the documentary on the post office scandal. That shifted public opinion, and then it shifted what government was able to do. And just possibly now we're at a time where we've reached the limit of what analysis and statements from people like me can do, and we're either going to be hostage to events, or we're going to find a way of entertaining, if you like, our way into different choices. Bizarre, but that seems to be how the world works.
That was General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of Joint Forces Command and one of the authors of the most recent Strategic Defence Review. If you want to read more of his thoughts, head to thetimes.com, and we'll put a link in the description of this episode to a piece he wrote for the paper titled "To Repel Putin, Britain and Europe Must Be Ready to Punch Back Hard." The producers today were Micaela, Arneson and Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, or if you'd like to get in touch with us, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. And if you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.